Hello. So Anne couldn't be with us again this week. We hope to have her back for the next event, but I'm Rick Lovard. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a program of the National Academy of Sciences, and I'll be starting us off solo today. So if you haven't heard of the Exchange, all you have to do is dial 844-NEED-SCI or contact us through our email. And if you are a writer, producer, storyteller of any kind, and you have a question about science, we will connect you with a field expert who hopefully knows what they're talking about. We've done this over 3,400 times, including many superhero films that you may have seen over the years. If you are a STEM professional and this is the first you have heard about our work, please be in touch with us because we are always looking for new experts to connect with people in film and media. I have to thank our sponsors today, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, without whose support we would not be here today. We also get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. And I also want to take an opportunity to thank all of our individual donors, like many of you who have given. When you give at the supporter level, it comes right back into this programming so that we can do more of it and hopefully better. And so thank you very much. I also want to thank Courtney, Sachi, Jeff, and Ameche for all their support. We couldn't do these events without them. And so today, you are going to hear from Maja Matarić, and she will speak, and then I will pop on. And if at any point during Maya's talk or while I'm doing Q&A with her, if you have a question, please write it right down here, and I will ask Maja. And if we don't get to your question, I am sorry, it's totally my fault, and not Maya's. So, and we do ask this week, by the way, that you stay away from the topic of sex robots. This is an event about companion robots. Those other robots are doing other things. So my rabbit hole this week, the National Academy of Medicine awarded its first Catalyst Award as part of a Healthy Longevity Global Challenge competition. And it was given to a project that uses artificial intelligence to assist people with dementia. I thought that was really cool in a way that our program or our institution is working in this area. So if you're interested, check out the link below, please. So without further ado, Maja Matarić is a terrific speaker. She's been on our stage many times. Her work is amazing. Her dry wit always gets me. So without further ado, Maja, please take the stage. It's your stage.
Thanks, Rick. All right, it's great to not see 266 of you, but we will have some good banter, I am sure. All right, let me share the screen and the sound, and here we are. So we are all familiar with the pandemic that we're in. Let me get that. Okay, much better. All right, so we all know the pandemic we're in, but you might not know or might not have noticed that we've actually been in a pandemic much longer that is not of a viral kind, although it is of a social viral kind. And that is the combination of isolation, loneliness, anxiety, and depression. So the rates of these conditions / challenges are certainly at epidemic levels in the Western world and in the US in particular. And so this talk today is really focused on how we might develop technologies that can help to address this particular problem, a very large problem. And so what we're hoping to talk about and focus on is how we can support and empower people, but fundamentally to support and empower people to help themselves. So that's the first thing that you might find surprising about this talk. This talk is not about robots doing someone's work. And even as a companion, a robot isn't really trying to lift you up. You kind of have to lift yourself up. And that's one of the big secrets that we have learned from neuroscience, cognitive science, and social science. And so the question becomes, how can a companion robot generate and sustain motivation in a human so that that human can get out there and do their best in terms of improving, coping, dealing, adhering to whatever the medical best practices are, and having grit to persevere through a lot of challenges, failure, disillusionment, etc. So it's really about all of these medical things that we know are right and good for us, but they're just too hard to make happen every day for each of us. And that's what a companion comes in And if there isn't a human companion, then can a robot companion fill that gap? So we're really trying to create social companions for people that will be the kinds of companions that people want to interact with. So something that you look forward to talking with and interacting with. And that is this field of socially assistive robotics. So this field is about 20 years old now, almost. And the idea is to develop robot companions that can help people help themselves. So the overall big picture is that a robot, will be there for you continuously, and it will help you in a very personalized way. So it is a physical machine, and we'll talk about why that is important. It's a personalized machine, so it's helping you specifically. It's not, for example, a smart speaker that just answers generic questions. And it's there to help you with motivation through companionship. And there was a nice article about this when the field was quite new by Jerry Grootman in The New Yorker. And it's fun to read that now and look at what's happened over almost 2 decades. Now, you might ask, and you should ask, why a robot? Why can't we do this with, through our screens with a smartphone, or maybe even a wearable like a watch or a Fitbit? And the reasoning is actually very profound, because it has to do with how we as humans are wired. So we're wired to be social creatures. And so if we look at brain scans, and these are stylized images of actual brain scans, if you look at how your brain behaves when you're interacting with the screen versus when you're interacting with a physically co-present agent, so usually another human, but it could be a pet or a robot. And what we see is that, roughly speaking, more of your brain is engaged when you're physically interacting with something physically co-present with you in the same space than when you're interacting with the screen. So more of your brain and higher levels of activation. So that's really important, because what that means is that when we have such interactions with peers that are in the same space with us, we're more motivated, we find more satisfaction in such interactions, and we have better health outcomes. And this pandemic has demonstrated that in spades, because we have not been able to do as much of that. Of course, we've all seen the outcomes in terms of loneliness, isolation, and depression. So if we ever needed more evidence, it was presented to us against our will. Now, it's important to notice that the role of this robot companion is that it's many things that it is not. It is not a toy. It is not a pet. It's not just a camera. It's not a smart speaker. It is really a supportive and knowledgeable buddy, a peer of yours, or maybe a coach. Maybe it's even beyond a peer. Maybe it has some expertise that you don't have. So for that to be the case, it has to have this thing that we call agency, right? It has to be an individual in its own right. It kind of, quote, has a life of its own. And it behaves in response to you. It isn't rote. For example, if you say the same thing to it 3 days in a row, you don't get a verbatim canned answer every time. You might get a slightly different answer, should be consistent, but it might be slightly surprising. That's how humans behave, after all. It has the right mix of being predictable and consistent, but also being a little surprising. That is the kind of set of character traits that we look for. And it's also inherently motivating and rewarding. So you can think of it as a buddy or a coach that you actually want to interact with, not a nag, not something where you're like, oh, it's like mom. No, but something that you're like, oh, cool, let's check in with the robot, right? So that's what we're after. That's the kind of companion that we want to develop. Let me show you a vision from our early work in stroke rehabilitation. One of the major issues with stroke rehabilitation, of course, it's loneliness and loss of function, the loss of ability to do activities of daily life naturally, like grabbing that cereal box and, being able to just proceed with life normally. So it's an issue of grit and persistence.
Good morning, Connie.
So this is our very early work, and as you'll see, things have moved along. But the idea is that the robot is watching and caring and there to help.
Hey, Connie, have you thought about your exercises? I bet you're feeling strong today.
Well, at least she's eating fiber. But yes, people will not feel strong every day, and they won't want to interact with the robot every day. And let's hope the robot doesn't fall into that beautiful fountain, because that would be bad.
Hey, Connie, are you ready? I brought my workout clothes.
So don't ask me how the robot changes clothes. That's a separate research topic that we don't pursue. But the idea is just enough persistence and kind of, fun interaction to get you to do what you need. and then support while you're doing that super boring rehabilitation exercise that makes you feel really bad because it reminds you of your limited ability and what you've lost.
Seriously? You can do better than that.
So it needs to challenge you, but at just the right level, not too much, not too little, whatever is right for you. And whatever is right for you.
I might be a robot, but I am not blind.
Whatever is right for you might be the right amount of humor. Like a little bit pushy, but not too much. Not trite humor, right? And that all depends. What kind of humor is your humor? What works for you? What is going to drive you to do that thing that you need to be doing, but you really are finding hard, demoralizing, boring, you name it. This is a bit of an homage to Rocky, always timely. All right, here's the clincher. The point of companionship and support is to get you to do something really hard, like eating with your stroke-affected limb, when you can use your other limb and never recover. So why does she do this? Because look, there's that social check-in. Showed the robot what she has accomplished. All right, so let's talk about some real robots now in the real world. Well, that was a real robot. So these kinds of companionship robots have been developed over the past 2 decades for various areas of use. And so I'll tell you several of them. So one is physical rehabilitation, like after stroke, and other kinds of skill training. So for example, we've worked with stroke patients, like you saw. We've also worked with people at risk for obesity and type 2 diabetes, helping them to exercise. You know, exercise in public can be very demoralizing. Going to a gym sounds really fun unless there's stigma around how you feel and what you look like. One of my students also developed this wonderful robot on the right that you see, the little owl, which basically would remind you to not sit for too long, so to avoid being sedentary. And we deployed it in the homes of elderly users for multiple weeks, and they learned to not sit down. In fact, they'd love to stand up and dance with the robot. And it was wonderful. They would anticipate the robot and they just loved it. And then as soon as we took the robot home, they went back to their old ways. So what does that tell us? Habit formation is hard and social companions are really effective. We've also worked with some of the youngest users of any users of robotics, and that's very young infants. And so let me show you what that looks like in action, and then I'll tell you why it's really important that this be a robot. So, and you can never forget that this was done at USC. But the robot shows the baby what to do, and the baby is really motivated to look at the robot. You know, robots are cool. They're even cool for babies. And so the baby looks at the robot, eventually learns to do what the robot is doing. And that's how we encourage the baby to exercise the limbs that we need them to exercise to avoid delays in learning. And this is particularly important for kids who are potentially on a path to potential motor delay, such as kids on the autism spectrum. Now, the thing that's really cool here is that you can't do this with a screen. If you show a screen to a baby, the baby's brain lights up a lot in the cortical area, visual cortex, but the baby doesn't learn or imitate the screen. But it does learn and imitate from a robot. So that's really wonderful. Now, you could also ask, why don't we do it with humans? Well, sure, but the big humans are too big. And I can't train a baby to be a coach for another baby. So here's an interesting niche where the robot really is almost necessary. There's been a great deal of work on robot companions for autism. Autism has been a tremendous challenge for clinical work as well as research because it manifests itself as a combination of symptoms and symptom severities, and every individual is different and every individual is complex in their own way. And so there's so many ways in which different technologies have been used to help for social skill training, speech therapy, cognitive skill training, and more. I want to show you a quick video that shows a vision of what we are working on. So let me show you this now. This is a fictional video, and then I will show you what's actually been done, which hopefully is not too far off. Boy on the spectrum.
You know, my ancestors were dinosaurs.
That's a real robot from our lab.
All mine birds. In factor descended from two-legged theropods, like Tyrannosaurus rex.
Are you a robot?
My name is Kiwi. What's your name?
CJ.
I don't have a lot of friends. Most birds think I look strange. Do you think I look strange? CJ, would you like to play a game with me? Where are the happy faces? Can you count them? They're smiling. They're playing. Every face you see is sharing information. We might miss it all unless we take the time to look. Can you show me your happy face? This is happiness. Great. This is sadness. Can you try? Great job. How about here? Very good. Today we're going to search for buried dinosaur bones. Millions of years ago, there was a duck-billed dinosaur called a hadrosaur.
Actually, millions of years ago, Southern California was underwater. Hey guys, do you want to go play basketball? Yeah. Hey, I think maybe I saw some dinosaur bones over there.
Who would win a fight between T-Rex and a super long-necked dinosaur?
Brachiosaurus?
Yeah, Brachiosaurus.
T-Rex would get
Smash! No way! T-Rex would be like,
T-Rex wouldn't even get close. Brachiosaurus would be like this with its neck and tail. It would be like getting hit with two monster trucks.
There are a lot of things in that video that were actually important. And as it turns out, this was actually in a film festival. I didn't make it, but I'm honored that our work was presented. So there's several things that are really important in that video to notice. It's not the idea that we want to give the robot to the child so that the robot will be a replacement for friends. On the contrary, the point is that the robot should be a magnet and a catalyst to make more friends. But kids can be tough and mean. And so, kids on the spectrum, individuals on the spectrum, get very little practice with social skills because others won't necessarily play with them and talk to them and approach them. And so the robot can provide that early training and can maybe serve as an attractor for other kids to play. And so then you get this catalytic effect that this video demonstrates. So that's really important. And that's a big part of the goal. So let me show you a study that we did at the University of Kansas in collaboration with Yale University and other partners, where we actually deployed that same robot in the homes of kids on the autism spectrum for over a month at a time. And not necessarily in neighborhoods where it was very easy to do this. So we worked with homes around USC and inner city LA, where things like really good internet and even air conditioning could not be assumed, which I think are really important things to worry about deploying real robots in real homes of real people. So let me show you, and these videos are on the web, so I won't show the whole thing, but this is a Science Nation video because this was funded by the National Science Foundation. It gives you a little idea of what we did.
Meet Adrian, age 6.
This is some great work.
And his robot friend, Kiwi.
You are doing an amazing job.
On this weekend morning, they've settled in to play some games, along with Big Brother Darren. Adrian is on the autism spectrum, and Kiwi is no toy. It's a socially assistive robot.
You are doing really great. Keep up the good work.
So this whole video is on the web, and I really encourage you to look at it because you can see, it's about 5 minutes long, but it talks a lot about what is actually involved. So here are just a few things to notice. First of all, in the real world, it isn't just the child, right? There's the mom and there's the sibling, and there's some interesting dynamics of interaction that happen there. And the robot has to be able to adapt to that. It also has to be able to adapt to the user changing over time, learning, but also getting frustrated, having a bad day, a good day, all kinds of things. It's this constantly evolving interaction. And that's what's really challenging and really interesting. And, he has a screen already, but the screen is not going to teach him social skills. It's not going to teach him, eye gaze. It's not going to teach him all of these things that he needs in the real world, which is why there's a physical robot there, in addition to the screen. The screen is great for presenting fun games and wrapping math into something more interesting. But in the end, it's the social partner, the companion, that makes a difference. So some other things that robot companions have been used with, and here are some things that we did. For example, we worked with first graders to teach them healthy food choices. And it is really nothing more boring for first graders than to listen to why they should be eating more fiber. But, when a robot is trying to learn it with them while it's trying to train in order to beat its brother's win last year in a dragon race, well, then it's a whole different game. So let me show you a little interaction with a first grader learning about healthy food choices.
Yum-tastic! Fiber One is the best one. Why do you think this is such a healthy cereal?
Because it's healthy for me and it makes me strong.
Yes, and it's healthy because it has fiber in it. Do you know what fiber is good for?
Well, do you? Should we talk about it some more? Okay, maybe we want to talk about fiber right now. But that's the idea. How do you talk to kids about fiber and, all the other things that come with it? So we did this really fun study, developed left the robot in the schools for 6 weeks, and the kids loved it. And they did learn about healthy food, and they did make better health food choices. And let me tell you, the parents were also very grateful. So we're happy to see that. We also did a study where we put a robot in Children's Hospital Los Angeles to help children cope with pain. The current way of coping with pain is to distract, right? So, watch a movie, which doesn't turn out to work very well, especially with chronic patients who know that the pain is coming. And so it's very difficult to distract them because, you can't just say, oh, look over here. And so having that companion to help them cope, that's intrinsically kind of fun and interesting, was shown to be quite effective. All right, so now why is this hard? Why don't we have this everywhere? Why didn't we have all of these robots around during the pandemic? Well, a part of it is that there just isn't enough investment. I'm going to say that right up front. So tell everyone, put some money into this to help people. But aside from that, there's some real interesting technical issues. All users are different and they all change over time. So the idea that we can take big data and get a bunch of data and then that will just tell us what to do, it doesn't work here. It may be great at recognizing faces, but this is much more complex because the user, the person for whom the interaction is being structured, is changing all the time. So you have to personalize. And it's very difficult to personalize because people are not necessarily typical, especially in some populations. So the machine needs to observe and learn from the interaction and then keep adapting. So it's this evolution that's mutually shaped. It's a dynamic that goes on, and it's very interesting and rich and fun. So I want to show you an example of a 3-year-old interacting with a robot in real time over a learning game, something that we all should have had while kids had to stay at home over the pandemic. Unfortunately, we didn't.
From 1 to 6. Count them out loud with me. 1. 1. 2. 2.
So you have this infinitely patient tutor companion who pays attention to whether the child is doing the game right, whether they're making eye contact, whether they're speaking, and they're giving physical feedback like nodding and movement, which is also fun to look at and teaches social skills. And then also they are giving the cognitive feedback that is needed. And when you cannot have the teachers and the peers around, such as in a pandemic, this kind of thing has much better outcomes than screens, going back to our point about how our brains are wired. So I would have loved to have seen this in many more homes, because the video that you just saw was researched by 2 of my grad students 6 years ago. So there are some commercial products out there. All of these images that you see are actual commercial products on the market. But it's not as if you could just go to Amazon and download a robot that will serve your needs as a companion right now. So there's still much to do, but hopefully this progress will speed up, because there's no reason why it shouldn't. And so to summarize, robot companions really can empower people. There are a lot of studies, like tens of thousands of peer-reviewed scientific papers that show that Such robots can improve your health outcomes. They can make you be healthier. They can make you be happier by certain measures. They can encourage you to interact more, whether you're elderly, on the spectrum, or just a lonely person. They increase measures of empathy. They actually make people more empathetic to one another. And of course, they help us learn and train and improve along many axes. What they do really is reflect back at us who we are as humans. So there's a lot of potential there, and there's some really interesting issues to work through. So I will stop there, and I look forward to you bringing up interesting questions so that we can dig deeper. Thanks very much, and this is an invitation to Rick to come back.
Here I am. Thank you so much. That was a great talk. So the first question we have is from Ben, who wants to know why you think there are a bunch of well-funded commercial ventures. He lists a bunch of companies here that I frankly don't know, but Jibo, Curry, Enki, Cosmo are a few that he names that he said sort of haven't really launched. And he wants to know why you think some of these commercial ventures into robots companions haven't gotten there yet.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I'm happy to tell you that if you Google, you will find lots of articles written on this. I actually did a startup in that same time frame, which did succeed. And here's why. There's a very simple answer. All of those companies that were mentioned did not have a viable value add product. So they were largely about entertainment. For example, Jibo was a beautifully designed robot, but its purpose was going to be things like reading your recipes and taking pictures. But we already have cameras, we already have phones that can do that. And my phone will read me a recipe and it will take pictures, and it's a lot cheaper. And so the point is, when you think about companions providing an actual value, like helping someone rehabilitate, helping a child learn, helping an older person feel less lonely, then you have that value proposition. And so that is the problem, is that I think a lot of the companies have really not looked around at where the need is in society. Why aren't we focusing on loneliness instead of taking pictures and reading recipes? See, that is the gap. And I think it's not that hard to fill it.
So Art wants to know that if we can't be truly consistently compassionate and humane to each other, how could we possibly program a machine to be that way?
That's a great question, and it has two parts to the answer. The first part is we can always make machines better than ourselves, right? So that's the beauty of it. The machines do not have our underlying biases, issues, lived experiences. They don't have any of that. So, you can program it to be as wonderful as you would like. But machines are reflections of ourselves. And so, for example, we see that robots that have been put in public have actually been kicked and mistreated, and people have been very violent to certain robots that have been put out in public places. Why is that? Why do they bring out the worst in us, right? Well, they bring out the worst and the best in us. People have also been really nice to robots, and they disclose very personal things to them, and they want to help them if a piece breaks off. So what does that say about us? It says something about us and otherness and how we treat otherness. We're pretty bad at that. So I think there's a real opportunity as we build machines to bring out the best in ourselves. So this is a perfect opportunity. It may be hard to better ourselves, but we can create machines that are better reflections of us. So I have great optimism on that front.
So Kate brought up the movie Robot and Frank, which I know we discussed in some of our prep calls. And for those of you who haven't seen the film, it's about an older gentleman who sort of, I guess, led a life of crime, who is given a companion robot. And do you have any thoughts or comments on the science in that film?
I want to say kudos to Kate. That's a great movie. Not enough people talk about it. That is a fantastic movie. WALL-E's also good, but Robot and Frank gets really at this issue of companionship. It gets at what does the robot companion need to do to really be interesting to the person that they need to work with. And in this case, it's a curmudgeon-y guy played superbly by Frank Langella. And basically, he doesn't want this robot. He doesn't want this newfangled thing. And so what does the robot have to do to get him to make it a buddy? And, it ends up being a heist movie. And it's just great because, they're optimizing two different things, but in the end, they find they find an intersection. So, the robot just wants Frank to do things like be active and, eat properly. And Frank doesn't want to bother with that, except if it's from a buddy that's going to help him do his last heist. And there's a great scene in that movie, which I think is very true. So, people always worry about, oh, robots are going to get together and, take over the world. And I always think that's really funny, because why would they do that? Like, what do they get out of that? And so there's a great scene in the movie where two library robots, like these clunky things, they come together and they're talking. And one of them says, hello, I am functioning properly. How are you? I am also functioning properly. And then they go their separate ways. And you know what? That's about right. Because
Wow.
what do they have to talk about? What are they going to talk about? So I think it's interesting to think about robots from the perspective of who we are as people versus what they are as machines. They're nothing like us. They're only like us if we build them that way.
Well, that actually gets right to Marcia's question. She wants to know how we draw the line on humanness in their designs. And are there any sort of standards for that or any guideposts for you?
So that's another really great question. Thank you, folks, for these amazing questions. So there's a lot of question about, first of all, what should the robot look like? There's no recipe book. We don't know because, we as humans have never interacted with robots before. So we have to try it. It's a whole field of human robot interaction where people build a robot and then they see how people react to it. It's kind of a slow process, though. And so we know certain things that are the same with people as they are with robots. If the robot is very large, pretty much bigger than about 3/4 of your size, you will have an inherent reaction internally that you may not even be aware of, but you'll be a little bit, it'll be a little much, kind of like if you're sitting next to a really large, big, burly person on the plane, right? So there's an inherent physiologic response. But then there are all kinds of other things like, what kind of personality would you like the robot to have? How assertive should it be? These preferences are rooted in our own personality and experience and culture. And so we've actually done studies where we've developed personalities for robots. And we found that for people who are on the extroverted side of the spectrum, extroversion, introversion spectrum, that is, they really liked extroverted robots. And when they had to do something really boring, if they were teamed up with a robot that had a similar personality to themselves, they performed the task better. And they said, oh, this was not so bad. I like that robot. So there are these very human traits that we project on robots, but it's not clear how to do this right. And if you do it wrong, then it's very, very creepy. And that's the uncanny valley. So that's the idea of the uncanny valley, which is that the robot is trying to be realistic, but it's not quite right. And it looks creepy. And the interesting thing about the uncanny valley is it's not just about the looks. It could be, for example, the voice. We've had robots like the humanoid you saw in my talk, that the one with the stroke patient, doesn't look like a real human at all. But if I give it a human voice, now it becomes creepy. So there's a lot of opportunity for creepiness, and you have to be very careful about what to not try to make too realistic.
Just to put a button on that thought too, can we enter the uncanny valley also with behavior?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. So the uncanny valley it's a large valley. So you could get stuck in it, no problem, from many perspectives, right? So you can have a robot that looks too realistic, but doesn't follow with behavior. It could sound too much like a real person, or sound like a person, like if it's a person's voice. This pitfall, by the way, was also done with animation. If you have an actor whose voice is very recognizable, people find that kind of creepy because it doesn't match with the character. And certainly behavior, right? So the behavior of the robot really has to match the expectations of whatever context you're using it in, and also what it looks like. So one example is, if you build a robot that really looks like Einstein, then you kind of don't want to put it in a janitorial role, because people will think it's weird, like it's cognitive dissonance. Also, for example, if you have a dog robot, and then that dog robot starts to talk to you like some kind of very smart coach and tell you things like, well, your blood pressure is kind of high, and I really think you should do this. Okay, that's also weird. Some people might like it. Most people will not like it. And so that's where we really kind of have to be careful about what are we modeling? What are we trying to create here?
So we've got a number of questions around other applications for the robots. In particular, Andy asked about to treat delays in speech development. And then Bruce also had a question about preventing relapses for people fighting addiction.
Great. Okay, so let me take the first one. Let me take Andy's question first. So there's actually has been work in speech therapy, and in particular, okay, we just did a study actually with some colleagues in Italy during the pandemic, treating basically speech and language impairments in children. And it was interesting to find out that some of the hardest things to overcome were not getting the robot to present, like a little training exercise and to be fun. It was the therapists that really, they were kind of uncomfortable with it. And that's a really big thing I want to bring up. It's really important to understand that those of us who are invested in developing this, we're not doing it to replace therapists. I mean, you always want the human care, as much of it as possible. The problem is you can never get enough of it. Outside of the pandemic, under normal circumstances, I don't know what that is anymore, I forgot, but even that, you can only get so many hours of trained care per day, per week. And that's just not enough. We know that any kind of support, the more, the better. And so that's the idea. The idea is that these things are filling a gap, but that's not always appreciated by kind of the clinical community. And that's an area where much work has to be done because people are just scared. They're scared. They think, oh, this thing is going to take my job. And that's not a goal. And it's not even, they're not clones. The robot is in no way replacing a therapist. So that's important. But just a very short answer to your question is yes, there's been quite a lot with speech therapy. There's speech therapy without the robot, just with using like an app. And that's also useful. It depends on kind of, how engaging is it? And do you get bored? And if you also want social skill training on top. Now, the other question about addiction, that's a really great, timely question. I was thinking about this actually before the pandemic. I thought, I wonder if we can do something about it. One of the frustrations is that these technologies are still not, cheap enough. Like there are products on the market that maybe will cost in the hundreds of dollars. And you really want them to be cheaper, to be pervasive. But yes, there is no reason why a companion, like a little physical buddy could not help you with an addiction problem, just the same as we're right now working on anxiety and depression. And these are issues of self-regulation. I would say they're the hardest things in the world. The hardest things in the world are controlling one's own behavior. If we could behave perfectly, well, then the world wouldn't have problems. But addiction is another, problem of self-regulation and a really tough one. And so, for example, what you could do is you could try to develop new habits. So the robot can help you develop new habits in order to battle the really difficult addiction-related habits. And that's known to be effective, but how do you keep it up? And so human companions are best, right? Like in AA, when there's someone to call, but not everyone has someone to call. And so that would be kind of an alternative to that, I would imagine.
So I think Jason actually has a pretty good follow-on question to this last one, which is, when you look at the development of facial recognition software, and then you kind of put that in a robot, and then you also add in Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and these algorithms that we have working in our lives, and sort of, I guess the heart of the question is, what are some of the risks? When we think about what social media has done for privacy and some of the, ways that we've had some unintended consequences from these technologies, what are some of the risks that concern you about these robot companions?
This is a great question with many dimensions. So give me a bit of time to address them all. I'm going to use it as like a soapbox to say many things. Thank you for that question. So I would say, first of all, that one of the big problems with our society today is that we're developing technologies without worrying really at all about the outcomes. So we create things, we throw them out in the world, and there's a giant worldwide social experiment to see what happens. And then we're shocked. Oh my gosh, look at that. There is a strong correlation between using Facebook and depression. And, it's now taken us, a decade to figure that out? And then what's the response to that also? So not to get too political, but the problem is we don't do trials to actually check, because why? Because obviously, the drivers are doing things as quickly as possible and making as much profit as possible. There are risks to all technologies. And so we have to test them first. So I want to say that up front. I know your question was about privacy, but I think there's a much more fundamental thing going on, which is that, we don't know what we're doing to human health and wellness. just I want to throw a few bits of scientific evidence out that I just know about. I didn't do this research, but hearing the human voice actually makes you happier than texting. So we have an entire generation that isn't hearing the human voice because, they don't like phone calls. When I was growing up, that's what you did. You just sat on the phone with your friends forever. That's not done anymore. And that has an impact on mental health. Even like little emojis with a smiley face do a tiny better thing than just text. Now imagine that, right? So that we're in an age of a certain technology band where people are being separated. And then you throw the pandemic in, right? So these are the kinds of things that we should test before we do a worldwide experiment. But we're not testing them. So that's a problem. Okay. We do test them in research, but so that's one part of the risk that I think needs to be brought up. Now, on the issue of privacy, it's a really good question because we are developing, and by we, I mean the world, not just the companion robots. We're developing machines that have eyes and that have ears. And if you have a smart speaker or a phone in your life, it's listening to you. And if you have a camera device, which is increasingly the case, including the camera on your phone or the camera on a smart speaker, et cetera, it's also looking at all times. So yes, privacy is being traded very actively for data because data are, the ultimate currency these days, right? Everybody wants more data. So unfortunately, that ship is so far beyond the horizon. And that's the part that I really have to convey to people, that these companion robots are not going to get any more data out that are not already out there. Because that's unfortunately the case, right? If you're on any social media, if you have a camera on your computer that is open, if you have your phone, your data are already being collected. So that doesn't mean we should forget about it, but it does mean that really complex issue of being aware of what you are giving up and somehow making conscious choices of what you do and don't do, and then also pushing for policies that are in the direction of what you would like to see on a larger scale, because we are all giving data up for free constantly. And so there isn't a dividing line that will happen with these robots. Why would it? I mean, I always like to make this little joke about, do you take your phone to the bathroom? Do you? Well, the microphone's on at all times. Just saying.
So Tiffany asks how you envision robots and AR perhaps working together in the future.
Great question. I actually have a PhD student who's working on that. So that turns out to be...
I should say augmented reality.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. You're right. Augmented reality. So most people have heard of virtual reality, right? So that's the idea that you put, goggles on and you really get transported into a different world that feels very real. Right? And that's wonderful. It's been used for training, et cetera. It's also really scary because you're in that world and not this world. I think Ready Player One is actually a great movie about that. It's actually quite profound if you think about it. Like, why don't we all just live in this world that's separate from everyone else, but it's ever so pleasant, right? So that's a serious concern. Now, AR is augmented reality. The idea is that you wear goggles or ideally just glasses that impose things into the things you're seeing, but they're not real, right? So for example, I have a robot that looks like a snowman and has no arms because, arms are expensive and all that, they break. So I put little glasses on, and now whenever I look at the robot, I can also see arms that don't really physically exist, but the robot can now use them. And he can also show me a thought bubble, so I would know what it's thinking. This is exactly what we're doing. We're developing robots that have these extra expressive abilities and thought bubbles. And for example, you can see their sensors. So robots don't necessarily have visible sensors, right? Like they may be using vision, but you don't know what they see and don't see. So it can show you like a cone of what its visual field is. So augmented reality is a good way to have a shared world between the robot and the person, but you're still in this physical world. You're in the physical world, the robot is in the physical world. I love that. I think that's so important and much healthier for us all than being in the virtual world where we're not together really, right? So being physically in this world together is very important for, neural training and learning and rehabilitation, et cetera. And so that's why I think putting robotics and AR together is just a great idea. Thanks for that question.
So speaking of things going together, I think Andrew and Ed asked two questions that kind of go together. So I'm going to put them together. One is that Andrew's concerned about what other problems may develop when you are using a robot to help a child who's having other, developmental issues. Are there things that can develop that can go wrong? And then Ed asks what some of the current limitations are. What are some of what research is needed to address these shortcomings?
Great, thank you. I could talk for a long time about limitations. Let me address the first one. So unintended consequences. In some sense, what you're asking about is what are the unintended consequences? Well, I don't know because they're unintended. But yes, it is a real concern, which gets back to my earlier point about we really have to test. But there's a higher level point that I think should not be lost here. And I do drill this with all the students that I get an opportunity to drill with. So when I get a statement from a student that talks about how AI is going to change the world and people will stop having to do work and blah, blah, blah. And I always try to get him to think about it from the perspective of all people, not just some people. And so that's the issue, right? We have a really hard time relating to how these technologies scale for everybody, including, whether you're talking about individuals with autism or individuals who don't have access to learning about the technologies, et cetera. And so, people worried about this with TV. They worried that if we show kids TV, then they're going to learn less and, not do as well. Turns out that's not actually true. Studies have shown that that's not true. But also, if you have no other enrichment in your life and no other social contact, then that is a concern. So the robot as a companion is filling a gap. But if the gap is so large that there's nothing else in the child's life, like there's no human who cares, well, yeah, there's going to be an issue. So we're talking about technologies that are filling gaps that aren't hopefully totally pervasive. And I think what you're getting at is, will the robot make some other gaps appear? And that would be very bad, right? The point is not that you give someone a robot instead of having someone like a parent or a sibling or a caregiver care for them. It's not a trade. And that's the concern that we have to worry about. That's why I always worry about people who say, oh, we're developing this technology, it's going to replace all people. Well, not in any really good way. So, but what it can do is it can force a multiply, right? So you have your therapist who is wonderful and you get the therapist for 2 hours a week, and then you have your robot for all the other hours of the week. That's the idea. Okay, so, and then of course the therapist should check in and make sure that things are developing properly and that there aren't any unintended consequences, et cetera. So, let me give you an example of an unintended consequence. And you saw it in the video. So for example, the child touches the screen of the robot. The robot doesn't say anything back. Okay, we don't actually want the child to learn that you can touch the faces of people, right? So you have to be very careful about designing the interaction. The things that the robot can and cannot do should not generalize to humans because they're not human. So when we design these things, we really care. Like we didn't put wings on the owl because the wings were really appealing to kids and they wanted to pet them and move them. You cannot do that in social situations. You cannot pet and move other people's bodies, right? So it has to be done very carefully. So that's sorry, I was going to answer the second question if I may.
I did warn you. Sorry, yes.
I did warn you that I'd go on and on, but it's a nice continuum. I have to drop some jokes in this to not get boring. Professorial, no. Okay, so what's hard about this? A lot of things are hard. So one thing that's still hard is perception. So, these are robots that have cameras. Yeah. But, what if you're like, you turn off the light or it's getting dark or, you're in the shade and right. So basically perception in the real world is still really, really hard. Like taking a machine that has to move around and be able to see the world. That's hard. Hearing is also not trivial. So understanding speech is not trivial. It's getting better, much better. Machine learning is really helping. But perception in general is hard. So for example, you have this wonderful robot and it's your robot and it's really helping you and it's your buddy. And then it suddenly starts talking to Rick when Rick comes in because he can't tell you apart. That's pretty heartbreaking because you thought you were special. Now, you would probably have to look and sound enough like Rick or the light should be dark or whatever for that to happen. But it can happen. And those perceptual things are still hard. And that's because we don't use all the information that the human brain uses, right? We don't understand context in AI. We don't understand what's all is going on. We don't know how to generalize from one situation to another. There are a lot of really hard problems that AI has no idea how to do, because you can't just solve them with a lot of data. That just, it's harder than that. So perception is a big issue. The other big issue I will throw out, and I promise to stop talking, is it relates to machine learning, and that's personalization. Remember I said we want technologies to personalize to us? That turns out to be really hard, because the robot has to pay attention to you and understand your preferences and your behaviors. And then does it get enough data? Are you being consistent? Maybe it's your birthday, but it didn't know that. Okay, that's pretty easy. The robot can know that. But like somebody didn't call you or text you. Somebody didn't text you, but it doesn't know that. So it doesn't have the context of why are you grumpy now? So there are a lot of things about context and what we call hidden state that are just still very hard for AI. So there's a lot of work to do, no problem.
So you spoke a second ago about how robots can augment psychotherapy. Samuel wants to know if you have any insight on where the sort of state of the state is with AI itself in psychotherapy.
So we're talking about therapy specifically, and I'm going to broaden that because it isn't psychotherapy only. It's really behavioral therapy of different kinds, right? But that's really interesting because I've actually been looking into this in detail. And so currently, the most validated methods for therapy are cognitive behavior therapy, mindfulness, breathing exercises. Those are kind of things, positive psychology. These are things that have been clinically shown to be effective. So now the question is, can we put that into technology? And there are apps, right? So you can get apps where an artificial agent like a chat bot will be the agent there for you, right? Now, of course, there are also apps where you get human live therapists. The problem is now this is starting to not scale. In Los Angeles, at all of our major universities, well, at any university, it's a year-long wait plus to get to see a cognitive behavioral therapist. So the need is so huge. So now the question is, are the technologies that are coming out actually effective? And we don't even have time to test them because they're so badly needed. They get spun out and then they get evaluated later. But I would say that the things that we as humans need to do and practice for self-regulation are on the surface very simple, right? Mindfulness, cognitive behavior therapy, reframing, right? All of these things seem simple, but are infinitely hard. And so having a spectrum of different companions and social support to help with that, that's really the answer. So it's going to be a collection of things. It's not going to be just your robot or just your app.
So John has a question that's on point to this, but I want to get to Rob's question really quickly, which is, are there links to the videos you played that people in the audience can go check those videos that were in your presentation out later?
Yes, definitely. And I can also provide those. I don't know if you folks can pass it on, but if you just go to my webpage, which was provided, I have a link to videos. So there are a bunch of videos from my lab, even more than what you saw. So never a dull moment.
Okay, so back to John's question. He says the sort of process of being able to read a person, know when to push harder, pull back, encourage. How is your field attempting to evolve that ability in robots to be able to read their human?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's one of these things that's very hard. So for example, when we did the study deploying the robots in the homes of children with autism, that's what we were trying to do. But it's hard to read individuals on the spectrum because they themselves have issues reading others, right? So you have to you have to collect data about this particular individual to see what works for them. Right. So that's in computing, that's called building models of each person individually. So it doesn't help me to have data from 10, 20, or even 50 kids with autism. You can never get data for 50. It's like, where would you even get that? But it doesn't help you with the specific one. So we're developing methods that collect data for each individual. Right. So that's one part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is sort of this whole thing of paying attention to what works and what doesn't. So, for example, if I'm teaching you to do some particular math skill and you're doing really well, if I keep rewarding you, you're just going to plateau. So I have to learn how to challenge you just enough. But of course, if I challenge you too much, you can get demoralized and quit. And so this combination of the right level of challenge and the right level of reward, if you will, praise, whatever it is, that's really individual. And so that's something that we work on. And we use machine learning. One form is reinforcement learning to figure out, it's funny, your brain does reinforcement learning too. So we're trying to kind of figure out all the aspects of the problem and then start to deal with them together.
Susan's asking for that website again. Jeff, could you please make sure that goes back into the feed? And then Michelle wants to know how children with autism apply the generalized skills they learn taught by the robots to people.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that doesn't just have to do with robotics. It has to do with therapy in general and behavioral therapy. So there's a lot of concern in general that it's hard to transfer the skills learned in a therapeutic setting, which after all is, a place where you play and learn, to the real world. And that's kind of an open problem, right? The idea is like, I'd love the robots to actually be in the classroom so that you could have the other kids around. And that's a natural place to generalize, because that's the goal. The goal is that you're in the real world with the robot, not just like in your little nook and corner, and then you are out on your own entirely, right? So, but until we get there, there are middle grounds, right? So, you do need someone like a parent or a peer to bridge that. And that's what's done in therapy in general.
I think we have time for one more. I'm gonna go to Norbert, who asks how robots specifically increase empathy and compassion in people. Is there research that shows this, or do you have examples of this?
Yeah, we have been working on this. A couple of other labs have also been working on it. For example, what we've done is we've had the robot serve like a mediator in a group to help a bunch of people get along. And as the robot kind of helped them to take turns, so it's easy for the robot to say things like, "Hey, Rick, thanks. You've said a lot though, but let's hear it from Maja," right? And people often will take that from a robot much more willingly than they will from a human. And so we get the robot to insert itself into a group and help the group balance. And then amazingly, 2 weeks later, we bring them back and we give them a cutthroat game where they have to compete, and they're less selfish than if they were just on their own. So this is really interesting. So we can actually, by demonstrating empathetic and kind behavior by the robot, we can teach people to be more empathetic. Unfortunately, though, people who are not being empathetic can again bully the robot, and that's happened. Even kids do it. And so the question is, how do you elicit empathy? And that is very much what we're working on, because I think we can agree we can all use a bit more empathy in the world.
Well, I think that's just about all the time we have for this week. And thank you so much. That was fantastic, as always. And can't wait to get you on our real stage in person one day soon.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, and by the way, you had, just over 90 questions. So we got to as many as we could. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. I want to thank everybody in the audience today, all of our supporters. Next week, we are going to be off on February 23rd. We will be bringing on Patricia Call to talk about how kids are developmentally impacted and coping through this pandemic era. So thanks everybody for joining us this week, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.